Thank you so much, Professor Sudhir, for the invitation and the kind introduction. And thanks to all of you for joining. Those of you, I presume everyone's in India, so it's 6:30 in the evening. Nice of you to join after a full day's work, and I hope that this will be of some interest. So, uh, is it okay if I take about 40 minutes and then we have time for questions?
Yeah, sure, please.
All right, thank you. So I will. What I'm going to do today is to give you a flavor of the book, which you see on the screen. I'm going to read out some sections of the introduction and the epilogue, and structure my talk a lot around that, so that you get a sense both of the contents as well as the way in which it's presented. Um, Mokshagundam Visvesvaraya was easily the most famous Indian engineer of the 20th century, but he was also much more. Six decades after his death, there's hardly a walk of life in India that doesn't bear in some form the imprint of his work, not only as civil engineer, but also as public administrator, constitutional analyst, and economic thinker. If you've gone for a picnic in the Brindavan Gardens near Mysore, if you've studied in Bangalore's Indian Institute of Science, or in Mumbai's Institute of Chemical Technology, if you lived through the heyday of the Planning Commission, if you are a cultivator near Pune or Mysore, if you are a Hyderabadi whose drinking water is supplied by the lakes Himayat Sagar and Osman Sagar, if you swear by Mysore sandal soap, you have experienced directly a part of Visvesvaraya's legacy. Visvesvaraya was born, can we click please? Visvesvaraya was born in a village near Bangalore in 1861, around the time the British Crown took over from the East India Company. He began his career as a public works engineer in the Bombay Presidency, and as you can see, he spent nearly a quarter of a century there. As a government engineer and later as a consultant, he contributed to the design, building, and maintenance of large irrigation works, dams, urban water supply and drainage schemes across the length and breadth of the subcontinent. Primarily within the Bombay Presidency, which includes areas of the Deccan, Gujarat, Sindh, etc., but also in other places. Sorry for the alignment problems there, but as he approached the age of 50, he accepted the position of chief engineer and later Diwan or prime minister of the princely state of Mysore, um, which was his home state. There, he pursued ambitious public works projects as part of a program to industrialize the state and modernize its administration. He was instrumental, as you know, in the inauguration of the huge multipurpose dam project on the river Kaveri, which is the KRS project, the creation of the first university in princely India, Mysore University, the establishment of several industries in the state, most notably an iron factory, which then became an iron and steel factory, and the founding of a bank and a chamber of commerce in Mysore. In retirement, he placed himself on the All India stage. In addition to being on a number of committees relating to engineering and technical education, he developed a distinctive vision for what he called national development. He was one of the pioneering proponents of economic planning and a tireless campaigner for Indian industrialization. Industrialization was really the cause that he held dearest to his heart. These ideas are exemplified in his books such as Reconstructing India, which he published in 1920, Planned Economy for India, 1934, Nation Building, 1937, and Reconstruction in Post-War India, 1944. As scholars have argued, Visvesvaraya's vision, with its emphasis on large-scale industry, technical education, and planning, formed a precursor to Nehru's nation-building program after independence. Both of them were part of the same cohort when they received the Bharat Ratna, and this was one of the earliest cohorts to receive that honor. It would be no exaggeration to say that Visvesvaraya's life mirrored the emergence of the modern Indian nation. He was born 4 years after the uprising of 1857. He came of age as colonial rule reached its peak. He was in his 20s when the Indian National Congress was established, in his 50s when World War I shook the foundations of colonial rule, and he was nearly 70 when Mahatma Gandhi led the Salt March to Dandi. By the time he was done with life, Visvesvaraya had witnessed not just the coming of independence, but also the first 3 general elections and the first 2 5-year plans of the new republic. Next. Today, Visvesvaraya is enjoying a resurgence as a national icon. His memory is invoked frequently in the context of nation building. His birthday is celebrated every day as Engineers Day. Metro rail stations have been named after him in Delhi and Bengaluru. You can see here the Moti Bagh station in Delhi. Educational institutions across India have been named after him. So have government schemes, including PhD scholarships and awards and so on. In Karnataka, Visvesvaraya has long been deified. Statues, busts, and portraits of the former Diwan are to be found in public parks, residential localities, street corners, shops, factories, and various kinds of institutions. Um, Even Google carried a doodle on his birthday in 2018. The photo on the left is of a bust in Mandya district, and it has the caption Annadata. So it is describing Visvesvaraya as Annadata because the KRS project, which was his brainchild, helped bring prosperity to the agricultural lands of the region. And on the right, the extreme right, you can see one of many statues in Bangalore. This one is outside the Institution of Engineers India uh, office in Bangalore. Part of Visvesvaraya's appeal lies in his image as an apolitical, technocratic champion of development. Technological solutions to challenges of governance enjoy wide popularity today. At the same time, there's also increasing public debate on the limits of such visions, especially from the point of view of sustainability and the environment. Are large multipurpose dams the best way to serve the aims of electricity generation and irrigation? Is large scale industrialization the only route to poverty alleviation? To what extent is economic self sufficiency necessary or useful for a nation? Um, in the context of these debates, we need a deeper understanding of Visvesvaraya's life and a nuanced appreciation of his legacy in all its shades. There's also other reasons to delve deeper into his career. Despite his renewed ubiquity as an icon, uh, Visvesvaraya remains an enigma to most Indians, especially outside Karnataka. We are all familiar with his frail, unsmiling, turbaned visage, but tend to know few details of his career and contributions. When he's highlighted, he's seen in rather narrow terms as either an ingenious engineer or an uncompromising administrator. But there were other dimensions to his life. He was also an important figure in India's political history, one who deserves to be studied as seriously as Nehru, Gandhi, Ambedkar, Tilak, or Bose. He was deeply involved in the vital constitutional debates of his day. He negotiated with viceroys and maharajas. He played an important role in the fortunes and outlook of the princely states. In many ways, he was an honorary member of the Indian Liberals. The Indian Liberals were the intellectual descendants of Dadabhai Nauroji and M.G. Ranade, who you see on the slide here, the top left. Visvesvaraya was also a close associate of moderate Congress leaders such as Gokhale, who's below Ranade, and Madan Mohan Malaviya and M.R. Jayakar, who you see on the right in caricatures drawn by a cartoonist named Emery Kellen. He worked closely with all of these people. He was a close friend of Ranade and Gokhale in his years as an engineer when he lived in Pune for around 14 years. He was deeply influenced by them. And later he worked closely with Malaviya and Jayakar in terms of pushing for dominion status for India in the 1920s. In fact, the Roundtable Conference, the famous Roundtable Conferences which were held in 1930s, were also a result of the backroom negotiations by all of these people, including Visvesvaraya. He was a very important part of that. Uh, again, click. The engineering side of Visvesvaraya's career also requires deeper analysis. He's popularly thought of as the greatest or even the first modern Indian engineer. But in fact, there were several other accomplished Indians in the profession, both before and during his time. So, how do we understand and account for his larger than life image as an engineer? In what specific ways did his career as an engineer shape his views on economics, on planning, on industrialization? Moreover, how did he get people to listen to him? As a person who was not trained in economics, when he spoke about planning, when he spoke about development, how did he claim authority on these topics? We also don't know much about his strengths and weaknesses, the conflicts involved in his career. Um, the public's understanding of his historical role has been shaped by, there are many accounts, but they're mostly reverential. Um, you know, um, they're anecdotal and they don't really delve deep into explaining the historical context of some of his work, although they are very useful as starting points. If we have to do justice to his life and career, we must peel back the layers of the public persona. What made this idealistic and fastidious personality tick, who seldom appeared in public without a full suit, who was almost never photographed smiling, who refused to meet visitors without an appointment, who apparently shirked publicity as a person, yet publicized his ideas throughout his life? What gave him his unshakable belief in the possibility of turning India, with its bewildering diversity of peoples, into a melting pot, a uniform, modernized nation? These are the questions I wanted to explore in this book. I decided we must pay close attention to the engineering side of Visvesvaraya's life. Many books about him tend to have just one or two chapters about his career as an engineer, and then talk about his work in committees, his work as Diwan, Mysore, and so on. But I think we need to take that seriously. I wanted to look closely at his training as an engineer, what influences he had, how did he develop his particular way of thinking about irrigation. I wanted to understand how his experiences in this early professional phase influence his thinking on development later on. Second, I wanted to stress the historical context. Rather than portraying him as a timeless genius who descended fully formed onto the earth, I wanted to understand what were the prevailing trends in engineering. How did Visvesvaraya's work fit into that story? Third, I wanted to bring to life the intellectual and official interactions with other people that shaped his life. So in this book, I spend a lot of time talking about Visvesvaraya's industrialist friends, his bureaucratic colleagues and subordinates, the teachers of his youth, the Diwans of Mysore who preceded him, and the royals of Mysore under whom he worked. You can see here part one of the book is dedicated to the early years of his life. There's a good 100 pages dedicated to his training, the various institutions he attended, the people who were influential, the mentors that he had, the kinds of even looking at the kind of syllabus in his various colleges and so on. Um, Finally, I decided the book's narrative needed to be firmly anchored in primary sources. In other words, um, it's not very useful to go on looking at existing accounts. One must go directly to the sources that were created at that time. So I wanted to look at newspaper reports, official documents, letters, memos. I found such sources in archives and institutions in various cities, in Delhi, in Bangalore, in Mysore, in Mumbai, even in London, in the British Library. So I retraced his footsteps. I went to visit these places, again, various cities, try to look at the places he worked. And I spoke to people who had known him or who had thought about him. There are very few people remaining who had known him because he passed away 60 years ago, more than 60 years ago. So as you can see in these contents, the book is organized as a chronological narrative and a detailed narrative of Visvesvaraya's career. And in every case, I'm looking at reconstructing that story in as much detail as possible. And I'll be happy to talk about any particular part of that later in questions if there's interest. But for now, I want to turn to a discussion of some of his legacies. Having reconstructed the story of his life and his career, what are some of the takeaways that we can have about his career? Next, please. So the first point is planning. In his own lifetime, Visvesvaraya was hailed as one of the pioneers of planning in India. As we've seen, as we see in the book, he was not the only figure to promote planning in the 1930s and 40s. There were definitely other people as well, but he was probably the most influential. He was certainly the most persistent. His interest in planning also didn't emerge overnight. Planning was kind of in the air in the 1930s, especially after the Soviet Union had launched their private 5-year plans under Stalin. But Visvesvaraya had been thinking about similar things for quite some time. In the 1910s, he had created something called the Economic Conference in Mysore. In the 1920s, he was chairman of something called the Indian Economic Enquiry Committee, which was supposed to find out how to assess the well-being of the Indian population. So he'd been thinking about these things for quite some time, for at least 2 decades, before he published his landmark book in 1934 called Planned Economy for India. He was not an academic economist. We should be clear about that. He didn't engage directly with the ideas of prominent theorists of his time, whether it was Keynes or Hayek or Harrod or Domar. He didn't carry out quantitative analysis of the data that he amassed. He was keen on statistics, but for him, statistics meant data, making comparisons to understand India's position with compared to that of the industrialized West. He was a keen observer of policies in various nations. He traveled widely. He made many international tours, which at that time was quite an impressive thing to do, often on his own, out of his own pocket. He paid for it. Um, and his insight that the collection of data must form the bedrock of economic policy was far-sighted. In fact, one of his enduring legacies, um, planning now is passe. We don't have planning commission anymore. But at the same time, the creation it led to the creation of a world-class institutional apparatus for statistical sampling and analysis, which still aids policy making today. Visvesvaraya's influence in post-independence India was not as direct as it might have been. By the time Nehru's government came to power, he was already in his late 80s, um, and uh, and also he was a little he was not completely enamored of Nehru's socialist approach, and so other people stepped in. People like Mahalanobis famously became important in the whole planning process. Um, but still, we can say that the mixed economy that emerged after independence um, was, a form of something that he had practiced in Mysore. However, he thought it was weighted too far in favor of the public sector. Among the early people who critiqued the government on these grounds were some of his friends. One of them was one of his colleagues, Murarji Vaidya, a businessman from Bombay, who founded, along with others, the Forum of Free Enterprise. He was also a good friend of C. Rajagopalachari, Rajaji, who was an alumnus of the same college, Central College in Bangalore, where Visvesvaraya did his BA before doing his civil engineering in Pune. And Rajaji famously promoted the Swatantra Party in 1959, also criticizing the emphasis on the public sector. Um, the Indian economy after liberalization is probably closer to what Visvesvaraya had envisioned. The field today is wide open for private players. Disinvestment is usually seen as equal to creating efficiency, but still the state continues to set targets and intervene actively in the economy. And that is a legacy of the planning experiment. We come to the second point, which is civil engineering. So we must first acknowledge that Visvesvaraya was not a creator of new theoretical knowledge, as far as I have been able to ascertain. He didn't leave behind formulae or theorems or other contributions that entered the corpus of engineering science. He didn't really present too many technical papers in places like Institution of Civil Engineers, etc. He was seen as forward thinking in his PW days. He was seen as innovative, but not all of his innovations were successful. There's a famous case of the automatic gates that he designed for Khadakwasla, in Khadakwasla Dam near Pune. Again, my research shows that yes, he did make important innovations, but he was building incrementally on things that many of his colleagues were also trying at that time. He also tried certain other things like creating a module for regulating the flow of water into fields in irrigation. And when he presented that at a conference of irrigation engineers, it was not accepted because it was seen as having several problems. So he was innovative, he was competent, but he was not an otherworldly genius. He was like anyone else. He was learning, he was improving uh, with experience. His achievement with the KRS Krishnarajasagar project in Mysore also was not so much in its design and construction. I mean, he was involved in the early part, but then it took another 20 years with other engineers to realize its completion. But what he was key, what was his key contribution was his zeal to get it sanctioned, to have the vision to get it sanctioned and push for it in the face of political and financial obstacles. So Visvesvaraya was undoubtedly a competent, confident, and unusually thorough engineer. From his PWD days, Public Works Department days in Bombay, he could be relied on to execute a wide variety of projects. He worked hard. He made sure his subordinates did so. He was a hands-on engineer. He was physically active and always spent time on site. He kept himself abreast of the latest developments. When he reached the higher levels of the profession, he became sanitary engineer in Bombay, chief engineer in Mysore, consultant to various princely states. He was decisive and bold in the projects that he drew up. But above all, he was an Indian engineer who stood up for himself in a world of racial prejudice. At this time, being an Indian engineer in the Public Works Department meant people assumed that you were less competent because the bosses were all imported from Britain. But unlike many others, he won rare tributes from his British superiors. He had confidence in his abilities, he had a distinct professional pride, and he had drive, qualities that made him stand out at a time when there was the colonial establishment didn't think highly of Indian engineers. This meant that he became a symbol of indigenous pride well within his lifetime. But he was more than just a role model. He also created a strong institutional basis for the engineering profession. We know he was responsible for the government college in Bangalore, which is today the UVC or University Visvesvaraya College. He was responsible also more or less directly for the creation of what became UDCT or Department of Chemical Technology, Bombay University. Um, he also anticipated the establishment of the IITs in a way, because in the 1920s, when he was asked to head a committee on technical education in Bombay, he recommended the creation of an institute on the lines of MIT or Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And this was pretty much what was said by the Sarkar Committee in the 1940s when they created what became the IITs. He played an active role in the governance of IISc, Indian Institute of Science, which had departments of engineering in addition to physical sciences. He nudged IISc towards a more practical, applied orientation. He insisted that it should produce knowledge of direct relevance to industries. Uh, and he also promoted commercial and technical training of a vocational nature. As Diwan of Mysore, in his writings, in his role on committees, he always pressed for the creation of a range of training facilities, not just universities, but also diploma granting institutions and industrial schools. Urban planning. His work as an engineer is linked to another area in which he had a deep impact, which is the shaping of urban India. He was a change agent whose imprint is still felt in cities large and small across the subcontinent. Many of them still use water supply systems that he designed or recommended. The most prominent example I mentioned already is Hyderabad. In Mysore, um, there's a huge sprawling Manasa Gangotri campus of Mysore University. In Mandya town, he has created indirectly a sugarcane belt. In Bombay, Marine Drive, the ultimate shape that it took was influenced by the recommendations of the Back Bay Enquiry Committee, of which he was a key member. In Hyderabad today, more than a century after he advocated the creation of a beautified zone along the Musi River, riverfront projects have been proposed by the Telangana government. Um, Riverfront projects have now become common across the country, although there have been serious concerns, ecological concerns especially, raised about them. In Bangalore, his influence is very keenly felt. Today, the city is seen as a global landmark, as a center of the Indian IT industry, and as a development center for the largest tech multinationals. But none of this happened overnight. Um, Scholars have shown that there was huge continuities between policies inaugurated in Visvesvaraya's time, later by Mirza Ismail. They both encouraged state investment in industry. Several industries came up in the 1930s and 40s. Hindustan Aircraft Limited in 1940. Again, he had an important promoting role in that. And when Mysore was incorporated into the Indian Republic, Bangalore and its environs continued to be a favored location for public sector industrial firms and government agencies such as ISRO. And it was this sort of trajectory which also led it to become a place where the IT industry could take shape. Environmental impact. Bangalore is only one of thousands of cities across the world struggling with the challenges of sustainability. 100 years ago, that term was not a part of the public discourse. The worldview underlying Visvesvaraya's interventions, whether in the urban sphere or in large infrastructure projects, um, was a quintessentially Baconian one, by which I mean it followed the famous dictum of Francis Bacon that nature was for humans to conquer and use. For him, science and tech had to be used to tame nature, make regions more habitable and orderly, and to help reduce waste. His interest in multipurpose dams reflected a worldwide pivot towards such projects. The KRS, which was his pet project, predated the American New Deal and the Tennessee Valley Authority by almost 2 decades. But he had seen other gigantic projects, in particular the Aswan Dam in Egypt during his international travels. The TVA later became the inspiration for a fresh set of projects in 1940s India, most notably the Damodar Valley project. Now, of course, we know today that these projects constituted enormous interventions in riverine ecosystems. They regulated the flow of rivers, changed or allowed the changing of their courses, submerged villages, displaced populations, transformed cropping patterns, etc. Even Nehru, who was a famous champion of such projects, sometimes had doubts about them. And in the 6 decades following independence, we now know that large dams dispossessed 40 million citizens, and people's movements have fought to highlight the environmental and sociological fallouts of these projects. But we have to understand that Visvesvaraya's views were formed in the context of the times that he lived in. Leaders across the world at that time were looking to these mega projects to deliver their societies from poverty or stagnation. Very few of them could have foreseen the extent of the challenges that would arise. Having said that, we are now in a position to understand that these huge projects helped develop nations, helped develop economies, but also created important challenges. And it's important to debate the limits of such interventions. Finally, I want to talk about Visvesvaraya's political impact and his contribution to various ways of thinking about governance. There was a tension at the heart of his approach to governance. His self-image was that of a democrat, and he was committed to democratic norms. At the same time, he had an instinctive attraction for systems that had clear chains of command and enabled decisive action. And this preference grew stronger as he grew older, and he became more impatient to see his ideas on development implemented. So his twin faces as a democrat and a technocrat, I think, are crucial to understanding his legacy. Let's begin with the former. I've already mentioned that one of the most underappreciated aspects of his career was his association with liberal politicians and his deep involvement in debates on constitutional reform in colonial India. Um, his friendship with Ranade and Gokhale introduced him to nationalist economics. It also made him a part of a network of thinkers. Gokhale, Srinivasa Shastri, Chimanlal Setalvad, these are all members of the old liberals, and their political orientation drew upon the tenets of British liberalism. They supported British legal and constitutional norms. They aimed to establish a parliamentary democracy. They saw the state as being composed of individual citizens with individual rights rather than communities. They believed in private property and the role of the market. They were incrementalists when it came to political reform. They were not radicals. So, although Visvesvaraya engaged with a wide range of political leaders, he was most at home among the liberals. In London, he joined what was known as the National Liberal Club as well. As Diwan of Mysore, he expanded the legislature and its powers. He allowed the press to have a degree of freedom. At the national level, he took a stand against the colonial government's imprisonment of its political opponents, and he played a key role in pushing for dominion status in India. Yet, despite all of these involvements in the democratic process and democratization of the Indian polity, there's no doubt that the more lasting impact of Visvesvaraya's career has been the popularization of technocratic thinking. The Indian middle class has long had a fascination for technocrats. Now, what is technocracy? The term technocrat usually refers to unelected technical experts in government roles, individuals with a strong belief in the power of science and tech to solve the most pressing problems of society. The technocrat is seen as skilled and efficient, a counterpoint to the apparently allegedly corrupt politician and the arrogant generalist bureaucrat. In the Nehru years, P.C. Mahalanobis, a statistician who trained in physics, and his associates in the Planning Commission wielded enormous influence. In more recent decades, engineers have held positions of great power in government agencies. Engineers have headed telecom agencies, the UID project, but they were all foreshadowed by Visvesvaraya, who became a prime minister of an important state and advisor to national politicians without ever contesting an election himself. His view of technocracy was as follows. Um, for him, his obsession was India's chronic poverty. Poverty was the single most pressing problem. Its continuation was a blot on the nation's conscience, and it had a simple solution, according to him: rapid industrialization. The recipe was to invest in the most advanced technologies, introduce the latest industrial processes, make full use of the country's natural resources. Agriculture too would be made more productive by applying science. Policies in all these realms had to be formulated on a scientific basis through the compilation and analysis of data. All of this was to be supervised by highly qualified professionals and business persons, and they would advise the elected ministers. He thought prominent industrialists should be cultivated by government and used as agents of modernization, since they had the organizational resources to drive industrialization. Now, this, of course, privileged a small section of capitalists, but he was not too bothered about that. He was not bothered about creating a level playing field for business. Rather, he was interested in the outcome in terms of industrialization. His own endeavors were never subjected to a formal audit. He had no doubts that his own vision for a modern, developed state was the right one, even though he was not an elected uh, leader. In the 1930s, he advised provincial governments and even the Indian National Congress through its National Planning Committee for some time. He then exited the National Planning Committee because he was impatient with his politician colleagues. He wanted them to commit to starting two large-scale industries in every province immediately. And they said, no, things must happen of their own course and so on. So Visvesvaraya's many public writings, where he wrote these tracts on nation building and on planning, etc., um, they had certain key features. They emphasized poverty alleviation, as I mentioned. They emphasized a quest for developed status. They emphasized self-reliance and military preparedness. They privileged technological solutions, and they appealed to volunteerism rather than political engagement. What they didn't dwell on so much was the kind of conflicts that are bound to arise between different social groupings. So he had a somewhat simplistic idea of how large technical solutions could help. Because when you start to execute some of these projects, there's always vested interests or competing interests at play. Some people stand to gain, some people can stand to lose. So there is a protracted political engagement that goes on. And perhaps this was not fully taken into account in his books where he was envisioning a future developed nation. But these are small, contradictions, and these are bound to happen in any intellectual's life, any public intellectual's life, especially one who lived for so long and did so many things as Visvesvaraya, who was in the public eye for almost 80 years, lived for 101 years. So, in conclusion, I'd like to say that at the heart of Visvesvaraya's life was a question that animated many intellectuals of his era. And that question was, what does it mean to be a modern Indian? For some, it meant going back to the ancient past to identify authentically Indian modes of thought. For others, it meant amalgamating Indian traditions with the fruits of modern science. For Visvesvaraya, it was neither of the above. For him, it meant starting from scratch. There was nothing inherently sacred about tradition. Science and technology had shown the universal path to development, and the nations of the world had to compete with each other to get on that path. It was a simplistic credo. It didn't take into account people's sentimental attachments or their need for community or the limits of nature, natural resources. On the other hand, it was a humanist vision. It was born of the wish to see an end to suffering. Visvesvaraya's modern Indian was a cosmopolitan, rational, hardworking, responsible, and self respecting individual with enough comforts to live a dignified life. His assumptions and prescriptions need to be refined with every generation, but those are goals that we still should be striving for. Thank you.
Thank you, Aparajith. So I think it's a pretty long book as well. 700 pages is what I've seen. Pretty
Yeah,
long.
it's about 550 is the narrative, and then there's the rest is footnotes, endnotes, and references, and all of those things.
Yeah. So one question, as I'll open the floor for others, but one quick question is, you mentioned that somewhere he had proposed an institute like MIT in the early stages, but was he also involved in the creation of the Institution of Engineers?
Funnily enough, I wrote about the Institution of Engineers in my previous book, and I didn't really find any evidence of his involvement in it. And partly that may have been because this movement was gathering steam around the time when he was Diwan of Mysore, and he was very busy with, with his projects there. He was not any longer a PWD engineer. So it was actually Institution of Engineers, as you would know, came about because the PWD engineers in India felt that the institutions in London were too far away. They were not able to go there often. They wanted a more local identity to look after their interests. Just after World War One, that kind of bore fruit and was set up in 1920. So this kind of coincided with the part where he had ended his career as a full-time engineer. So perhaps that's the reason that he wasn't very involved in it.
Because why I asked that is we definitely see a decoupling between the practice-oriented institution of engineers or practitioners coming together as institution of engineers versus the science-led engineering model which was adopted in developing the engineering colleges, right?
Right.
And they have probably bifurcated significantly after that period. So was any views that he had in that direction? Is there anything trace of that? Yeah.
No, I think I actually in all that he wrote, many hundred thousands of pages, I haven't seen any direct intervention with the Institution of Engineers. Although they did honor him, they named some some lectures and awards after him and so on. But he created something like that. He created a Mysore Association of Engineers, but that was really not. It was essentially a replication of the Mysore PWD. So whoever was there employed by the state was also a member of that association. But his idea was that they should meet annually and discuss, cutting edge problems and so on. But I think this trend that you're talking about, and I see it now as well, that, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems that now the prestige attached to engineering is, people who are graduates of IITs and institutions like that don't go and join Institution of
Yeah.
Engineers. It's almost like a different world. And I don't know if that trend was very already visible. It was probably not already visible in his lifetime, but it certainly becomes visible from the 60s, 70s onwards. But I think he mentions this idea of creating an MIT-like institution. This was supposed to be called College of Technology as part of Bombay University. But the key was that for him, that was not a standalone project. It was only part of the recommendations, and the other recommendations involved different grades of technical education, including industrial schools, including including more sort of hands-on processes. And the idea was that these graduates would become the sort of directors of industry, the managers, etc., because they understood the underlying technology. But it was not meant to be a creation of mass sort of engineering graduates.
Sudhir, could
Yeah.
I make a
Yeah,
comment here?
please, Shyam. Yeah, please.
It's interesting that you raise the question of Institution of Engineers in India, because after the 1918, what was the name of the committee set up by the British to look into professional education in India? Since after World War I, the supply of engineers from UK dried up. They opened the civil engineering institutes had been around in India earlier, but 1926 they opened Jamalpur, the railway technical school originally, and then engineering school for mechanical engineers. And Jamalpur had this was the old apprenticeship model of British industry, where most engineers came from hands-on work in the factory or whatever engineering or the field, and not from a theory classroom that you rightly mentioned. The engineering IITs and other engineering education is now based on largely. So Jamalpur emphasized about 2/3 was hands-on work in the factory, and 1/3 was a classroom work. And that was an interesting alternative. And of course, Jamalpur apprentices had to passed the Institutional Mechanical Engineers London exams, but not the Indian exam. But I guess Indian institution did not exist at the time. But that was an interesting alternative to what the modern engineering education has become in India today, because they don't have really experience of field work or factory work, and it's an interesting alternative. And it's interesting to learn that Visvesvaraya was very much on MIT side of it, right? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's very interesting. Yeah, I've come across the special class apprenticeship scheme that you mentioned in Japan.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And another interesting scheme along those lines is Jamshedpur Technical Institute, which was set up by the Tatas. And at one point was also around 1920, and it was in great demand. So people would come in. Initially, it was people, high school graduates, come in, and then they would have this. I think it was a 3-year program, like what we would call a sandwich course now, in the steelworks and in the classroom. So a lot of things happening of that kind. But Visvesvaraya was a product of the PWD at the end, and one of the things that shaped the culture of the PWD was that in the 19th century, when of course engineering was a hands-on apprenticeship-based model in the UK, the colonial government was a little upset with the engineers that it was able to find and send to India, because although they had practical experience, they didn't have a scientific training, but more importantly, for their point of view, they were not considered gentlemen. And they wanted sahibs. They wanted people who could represent the colonial rule and give directions, and also sort of represent the supposed benefits of empire. And that influenced the model of engineering which they then created, and which actually filtered down to people like Visvesvaraya.
Yeah. And if I may add, most of our engineering school graduates today are educated and trained to be sahibs and not to make a pin.
Right. Yeah.
Please.
I make a small observation and ask a question to Dr. Ramnath.
Thank you, sir.
Please go ahead. Yeah.
First, let me compliment Dr. Ramnath. You have covered very well all the legacies of Mokshagundam Visvesvaraya.
Thank you.
Very good talk. First, my small observation and then a question. The observation is that, as you rightly mentioned, there are great things about the life of Visvesvaraya which inspire the engineers as well as the young generation also, because not just because of his great contribution in the engineering, through his engineering projects for the states of Mysore, Pune, Bombay, and Nizam. In fact, recently the Mr. Revant Reddy, Chief Minister, was praising Visvesvaraya for his contribution for the cleaning the Musi river, and he want to beautify the BC river front. We also get, apart from the engineering contributions, what I felt, I was very happy to read about 15 years back when Hindu newspaper carried out one column about on the 50th death anniversary of the Mokshagundam Visvesvaraya. His sense of duty, his sense of service to the nation. So, have you covered that at the 100th birthday? He made 10 commandments to the youngsters. It was very interesting that Jawaharlal Nehru came all the way from New Delhi to Bangalore to participate in his birth anniversary, 100 years birthday anniversary. And of course, Nehru was there only for a few hours and he left because of some engagements in Delhi. But he gave a wonderful speech advising this particular young generation on 10 points. 2-3 points I still remember, but I want to know whether you covered all those 10 points in your book. If you have covered, that will be really interesting to read. A couple of points which I remember is that every citizen must be having a good character. That is one of the things. In fact, he mentioned we can build a great nation if we can build a good citizens. That is the one of the sentence out of those 10 important sentences. And another is that if you work out, you will not rust out. That is one of the again. So like that, there are 10 important statements he made on his birthday, 100th birthday. And standing erect, even at the age of 100 years, he could able to deliver more than 1 hour talk, standing and inspiring. Have you covered that? That's what I want to find out.
I do talk about the 100th birthday celebration. It was in Lal Bagh in Bangalore.
Yes.
And he kind of reprises the kind of lessons that he has been giving over the years. He's very consistent in his messaging. But actually, the newspaper reports that I saw said that he was actually not able to deliver the speech himself. So it was read out by his friend Morarji Vaidya, because he was. This is a Times of India report that appeared the next day. So this is, but I mean, we were not there, so we don't know. But it is quite likely, because he was 99 at that time. It was a 100th birthday celebration, but he was actually 99. And as is our practice, we tend to rush into these celebrations. But and there's also a little controversy about whether he was born in 1860 or 1861, which in the book I sort of say on the basis of official documents it's actually 1861. But having said that, he was definitely there. He was there in his suit, and he was in his turban, and he was listening to Nehru's speech. He had prepared, as usual, his points to be delivered, and his points, as you said, were exactly about this. It was about messages to the young generation, and so on. So he was very he was very clear on those things. And I think you rightly mentioned citizenship training. Citizenship training is an aspect that occurs in all his books. A book that he wrote in 1920 after World War I, Reconstructing India, the book that he wrote on planning in 1930s. All of his books, have long sections on how citizens should be trained to have a sense of responsibility, work together, and so on. So he was definitely very, very keen on that, and I agree. I mean, if you look at a counterpart like him, in other phases in history, perhaps in more recent times, they might have found more profitable avenues. I mean, he knew so many industrialists. He could easily have gone into a very, very lucrative consultant role full time, but he really spent his time and energy on thinking through these development problems. So I think that is quite remarkable.
Very good. Can you please share who is the publisher of your book and details to Professor Sudhir, so that we will get from Sudhir later?
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Any other questions from other members?
What are the things that influenced his way of thinking? If you, we have all read about how he saw Job waterfalls and then said, "Oh, what a waste of energy," and things like that. And that line of thought itself is quite novel. And from there on, he's leveraging the use of technology and modern methods and doing things for the creating public infrastructure, of creating things for the common good. So, what are the things that we can learn in terms of influences that add on his thinking and incorporate that into the present day education? For example, as of now, they do not go into a engineering field thinking that they'll do this. They're more tied down with the nitty-gritty of engineering and education than thinking about the larger good that they can do.
Absolutely, yeah. So thank you for that question. I think this is one of the key questions that motivated me to write the book. There's so many accounts of Visvesvaraya's life, but other than saying that he was born brilliant, it doesn't really give you much insight into how he came to these positions, how he developed these ideas. And of course, like anyone else, of course, he was a remarkable individual, but this was a result of things that he read, people that he met, and so on. So I think one key point is from an early age, from the age of about 14 or 15, he was in he came into direct contact with British educators of the Victorian era, which is the mid 19th century, and the Victorian era had a very strong culture of belief in progress. The idea that history moves towards a progressive future where things can get better and better. And there were some very popular authors. One of them was called Samuel Smiles, and he wrote these books, biographies of many engineers, including the railway pioneers of Britain. He wrote a book called Character. He wrote a book called Thrift. So these were quintessentially Victorian ideals that were being spread. And people like Visvesvaraya lapped them up. I mean, he actually read these books. He had these books, we know. He also read a book by an American preacher called Todd. It was called Todd's Manual. So it is about how a student should be, how a student should divide their day into hours, how they should practice, how they should study, what habits they should cultivate. So he was a very serious kind of a person in that sense. And then he came under the influence of these towering figures. One was called Charles Waters in the Bangalore Central College, and another was an Irish engineer called Theodore Cook, who was principal at the Pune College of Engineering. And unlike the British engineers who were in the PWD, these professors had a strong belief in the abilities of their Indian students. And they were quite encouraging. So he had a strong formative influence. And also, if you look at the syllabus, I mean, it's noteworthy that he didn't go straight from school into a four-year engineering program. He spent 3 years doing a BA degree. That doesn't mean he studied. He did an arts degree. It was called a BA, but it was mostly in natural science, mathematics. But he did have a grounding in English literature, history, geography, philosophy, things like this. So I think there is a certain breadth to his engineering, to his education, even before he entered his full-time engineering education, which allowed him to think of things in a larger sense. So for him, therefore, engineering doesn't become just being a member of that one enterprise, but where does it fit into the larger scheme of things? What is the larger goal of civilization? And I think he was exposed to some of these ideas at an early age, and he continued to read widely about some of these things. So I think that was key. The other thing that was very important for him was his exposure in Pune. See, most PWD engineers at that time would have been very scared to associate with people like Ranade and Gokhale and other people who had political role, because although they were very mild in the criticism, they were criticizing the British colonial government. But Visvesvaraya cultivated their friendship even while he was a PWD officer. He spent time with them. Along with them, he founded a club called the Deccan Club in Pune, where Indians and British people could mingle and talk. And so they were very strongly writing about how Indian industry needs to be encouraged, how colonial policy was falling short of allowing Indian industries to grow, and they were making a very polite criticism of colonial rule, but from the point of view of what they thought was needed to realize the Indians' potential. And so he was very, very closely associated with those people. He read what they wrote, and he went on his own to Japan in the 1890s. He was a big admirer of Japan. So his travels in these places, Japan, Italy, Germany, all of these places really helped him also to think of. So his basic obsession was, why can't we be like that? Why can't we be in that sense? And of course, that's a simplistic way of looking at it, but it was a very inspiring one for him, and I think that's what drove it.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Pari.
May I
Yeah,
say
please.
one small word? The way you are saying, it looks like that his attitude or his behavior, the way he has worked, looks like a kind of a system kind of expert who can handle both the social aspects, economical as well as technical, all of them together exactly. So that kind of attitude actually he showed in his life. That is what seems.
Absolutely. He saw the engineering projects in their larger social and economic context.
In fact, we had one talk on Sub had talked about Edison being a system builder as part of our talk series, one of the things. So we have come to the end of the session now. Just one last question is, you mentioned about the sort of contradiction that he had experienced by being liberal one side and being a technocrat on the other side. So did that manifest into some new model of thinking, or was it left there?
Um, I don't know. I think it's they are both, they are strands that exist that continue in our present day, right? I mean, we still have many of us have those two strands within us. So you know, the people there are people who believe that decision making power should be distributed on the one hand in a democracy, but on the other hand, we also believe that there are certain areas where only experts should be allowed to take decisions. So I think that is actually and I think this has not been fully resolved either in India or elsewhere in the world. And one of the reasons you see the rise of some extreme populist governments, whether in Europe or in America and other places, is that there has been a backlash um, against experts or elites. Right, a lot of people feel that a few experts are gaining too much power and are controlling things too much. On the other hand, we can't, democracy is important, but that doesn't mean that you don't listen to experts when it comes to things like public health, right? So during the COVID crisis, if people said it's my right not to wear a mask, I will not listen to the scientists, then that becomes dangerous as well. So I think it's a balance, it's a tough balance, which to this day people are still struggling with. I'll have to think a little deeper about that. It's an interesting question.
Uh,
Thank you, Aparajith. And
I'm
yes,
sorry. I'm sorry. I'm disturbing your closure, but I joined late. I am Shakti Gupta from IIT Kanpur, and I have one small question, if I may be allowed to ask that.
yeah, please go
Uh,
ahead, sir.
So I just wanted to know what were his views on Indian defense and engineering in military. Did
Yeah.
you cover it at the beginning of your talk? I might have missed it.
Yes. He was very keen on military self-sufficiency, and in most of his tracts, he talked about the importance of building up not only defense capability, but also people who were trained. So people who had uh, like not a conscript army, but people who had some military training. And again, a lot of these ideas came from his observation of Meiji Japan, which had modernized after the 1860s and tried to create a strong sort of nation. So he was very keen on that, but there's no evidence of his having directly interacted with the military or worked with them in any ways. This was more a kind of theoretical position that he came to in terms of his thinking. He thought of the world in terms of nation states, in terms of self-sufficient nation states, and he thought that for development you had to have industrialization, you had to have optimal resource use of resources, and you had to have a defense force that was capable of defending the nation, and you had to have protectionist policies. In other words, economic policies that favored local industry over foreign imports.
Okay, thank you very much. It was a nice coverage. Yeah,
Thank you.
thank you.
So thank you, Aparajith, for again speaking to us second time. I'll probably order the book now. I already read your first book.
Oh, thank you
Second
so
book,
much.
I'll go through this. In fact, I was going through the memoirs of Visvesvaraya, and what you mentioned about the initial stage when he joined the government in Pune, right?
Yes.
And the kind of interactions he had with his superiors and other things. Maybe there was a space where that liberalism he was lucky to have a good set of bosses as well. So that's what I
Yes.
could see
No,
there.
he was treated quite well by his bosses, but that's also partly because he kind of mastered the culture that they were comfortable with, and
Hmm.
so they felt that he was a kindred soul in a way. I mean, the sociologist Shiv Vishwanathan said in an article somewhere that if you remove the turban, if you below the turban, he was an Englishman, and in some senses he was. I mean, that was his upbringing, that was his education, and his influences were like that. So I think they were able to relate to him, and so he was a kind of bridge figure between Indians and the British. Professor Shivaram asked about the books. I just want to quickly mention that it's published by Penguin, and it should be available in most big bookstores, but otherwise it's definitely on Amazon. So you'll find it there.
Thank you. We will definitely.
Thank you for your interest. Yeah, thank
Don't
you.
they
So
say
thank-
that about Nehru also, that below the topi he was an Englishman? So anyways.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
So thank you all. Thank you, Aparajith, and thank you all. The next talk is on 20th November. It will be on by Dr. Gillian Jerick from Germany. And he's going to actually talk about the Paul Bates engineering design method and how it has evolved over a period of four versions of the books. And so he's going to speak about that on 20th November. So please join us. We will share the link for that once we get closer to the date. So thank you again. Thank you, Aparajith. Have a nice
Thank
weekend.
you so much. Bye bye.
Yeah, thank you very much.
And thanks a lot, Professor Sudhir, for your excellent coordination of the event. Thank you.
Yeah. Just tell them that this, as well as other talks, are on our website.
Yeah, the Cree website has all the previous talks.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.